大家好啊 ，Hello！
大家好。
今日又到我哋讀你聽嘅時候，我哋咧讀緊
Charles Dickens 嘅 Great Expectations，
終於識到啦，
第
第25節。咁啊，進入咗第2階段啦，就係 Pip 已經大個仔咗啲啦 ，Young Gentleman 啦，進入咗倫敦，亦都揾到佢嘅 Guardian， 亦都認識咗呢個 Pocket Family 啦，有朋友，有監護人，咁有敵人未咧？咁暫時都未嘅，咁上一次講到啲咩啊？
講到佢同 Mr. Wemmick 傾偈，
係啦，其實了解多咗，
了解佢都
係啊，了解 Wemmick 啦，了解咗。其實 Wemmick 就即係個外表係寫得仔細嘅，但係你話即係會深入了解佢，我諗都未必啦。即係主要都係講即係幫阿 jaggers 打工係點啦 ，jaggers 嘅工作係點啦 ，jaggers 嘅 client 係點啦。即係 law and order 喺當時嘅英國又係點樣嘅一回事啦。都係其實都係有錢人嘅工具嚟。講到尾法律都係咁但係即係暫時未去到咁嘅，只不過係講啲窮啲嘅人嘅苦況嘅，即係低下階層需要法律嘅保障，即係嗰種苦況啊，係嘛？即係唔容易咧，需要法律嘅保障，你揾律師幫你伸張正義係唔容易啦，需要好多錢啦。好嘛，咁啊第25節，好冇？我哋繼續。Bentley Drummle, who was so sulky a fellow that he even took up a book as if its writer had done him an injury, did not take up an acquaintance in a more agreeable spirit. 呢個 Bentley Drummle 上一回好似有提到佢。Heavy in figure, movement and comprehension, in the sluggish complexion of his face, and in the large awkward tongue that seemed to loll about in his mouth as he himself lolled about in the room, he was idle, proud, niggardly, reserved and suspicious. He came of rich people down in Somersetshire, who had nursed his combination of qualities until they made the discovery that it was just of age and a blockhead. Thus, Bentley Drummle had come to Mr. Pocket when he was a head taller than that gentleman and half a dozen heads thicker than most gentlemen. 即係佢嚟呢個人嚟揾 Mr. Pocket。Startop had been spoiled by a weak mother and kept at home when he ought to have been at school, but he was devotedly attached to her and admired her beyond measure. He had a woman's delicacy of feature and was, as you may see, though you never saw her, said Herbert to me, exactly like his mother. It was but natural that I should take to him much more kindly than to Drummle. 即係有一個叫 Drummer， 有一個叫 Startop. And that even in the earliest evenings of our boating, he and I should pull homeward abreast of one another, conversing from boat to boat, while Bentley Drummle came up in our wake alone, under the overhanging banks and among the rushes. He would always creep inshore like some uncomfortable amphibious creature, even when the tide would have sent him fast upon his way. And I always think of him as coming after us in the dark or by the backwater, when our own two boats were breaking the sunset or the moonlight in midstream. Herbert was my intimate companion and friend. 呢度終於其實呢句係 redundant 㗎啦，即係都知道 Herbert 喺佢心目中嘅地位㗎啦。I presented him with a half share in my boat, which was the occasion of his often coming down to Hammersmith, and my possession of a half share in his chambers often took me up to London. We used to walk between the two places at all hours. I have an affection for a road yet formed in the impressibility and of untried youth and hope. When I had been in Mr. Pocket's family a month or two, Mr. and Mrs. Camilla turned up. Camilla was Mr. Pocket's sister. OK， 即係呢個係姑姐啦，Camilla. Georgiana, whom I had seen at Miss Havisham's on the same occasion, also turned up. She was a cousin, an indigestive single woman, who called her rigidity religion and her liver love. These people hated me with the hatred of cupidity and disappointment, As a matter of course, they fawned upon me in my prosperity with the basest meanness. Towards Mr. Pocket, as a grown-up infant with no notion of his own interests, they showed the complacent forbearance I had heard them express. Mrs. Pocket they held in contempt, but they allowed the poor soul to have been heavily disappointed in life, because that shed a feeble reflected light upon themselves. These were the surroundings among which I settled down. 即係頭先講啲嘢全部都係人渣咁啦嚇，係好衰。And applied myself to my education. 讀書喎。I soon contracted expensive habits. I began to spend an amount of money that, within a few short months, I should have thought almost fabulous. But through good and evil, I stuck to my books. There was no other merit in this than my having sense enough to feel my deficiencies. Between Mr. Pocket and Herbert, I got on fast, and with one or the other were always at my elbow to give me the start I wanted, and clear obstructions out of my road. I must have been as great a dolt as Drummle if I had done this. I had not seen Mr. Wemmick for some weeks, when I thought I would write him a note and propose to go home with him on a certain evening. He replied that it would give him much pleasure, and that he would expect me at the office at 6 o'clock. Thither I went, and there I found him, putting the key of his safe down his back as the clock struck. Did you think of walking down to Walworth? Said he. Certainly, said I, if you approve. Very much, was Wemmick's reply, for I have had my legs under the desk all day, and I shall be glad to stretch them. Now, I'll tell you what I have got for supper, Mr. Pibb. I've got a stewed steak, which is of home preparation, and a cold roast fowl, which is from the cook shop. I think it's tender because the master of the shop was a juryman in some cases of ours the other day, and we let him down easy. I reminded him of it when I bought the fowl, and I said, pick us out a good one, O Britain, because if we had chosen to keep you in the box another day or two, we could easily have done it. He said to that, let me make you a present of the best fowl in the shop. I let him, of course. As far as it goes, it's property and portable. You don't object to an aged parent, I hope. I really thought he was still speaking of the fowl, until he added, because I have got an aged parent at my place. I then said what politeness required. So, you haven't dined with Mr. Jaggers yet, he pursued as we walked along. 係啊，佢成日問佢同你食咗飯未？Not yet. He told me so this afternoon when he heard you were coming. I expect you'll have an invitation tomorrow. He's going to ask your pals too, 3 of them, ain't there? Although I was not in the habit of counting Drummle as one of my intimate associates, I answered yes. Well, he's going to ask the whole gang. I hardly felt complimented by the word, and whatever he gives you, he'll give you good. Don't look forward to variety, but you have excellence. And there's another rum thing in this house, proceeded Wemmick, after a moment's pause, as if the remark followed on the housekeeper understood. He never lets a door or window be fastened at night. Is he never robbed? That's it, returned Wemmick. He says, and gives it out publicly. I want to see the man who robbed me. Lord bless you, I have heard him now 100 times, if I have heard him once, say to regular cracksmen in our front office, you know where I live now. No bolt is ever drawn there. Why don't you do a stroke of business with me? Come, can I tempt you? Not a man of them, sir, would be bold enough to try it on, for love or money. They dread him so much? Said I. Dread him, said Wemmick. I believe you they dread him. Not but what he's artful, even in his defiance of them. No silver, sir. Britannia Britain. Britannia metal. Every spoon. So they wouldn't have much, I observed. Even if they... Ah, but he would have much, said Wemmick, cutting me short. And they know it. He'd have their lives, and the lives of scores of them. He'd have all he could get, and it's impossible to say what he couldn't get if he gave his mind to it. I was falling into meditation on my guardian's greatness when Wemmick remarked, as to the absence of plate, that's only his natural depth, you know. A river's its natural depth, and he is his natural depth. Look at his watch chain, that's real enough. It's very massive, said I. Massive? Repeated Wemmick. I think so. And his watch is a good repeater. and worth £100 if it's worth a penny. Mr. Pip, there are about 700 thieves in this town who know all about that watch. There's not a man, a woman, or a child among them who wouldn't identify the smallest link in that chain and drop it as if it was red hot, if inveigled into touching it. At first with such discourse, and afterwards with conversation of a more general nature, did Mr. Wemmick and I beguile the time and the road, until he gave me to understand that we had arrived in the district of Welbeck. It appeared to be a collection of back lanes, ditches, and little gardens, and to present the aspect of a rather dull retirement. Wemmick's house was a little wooden cottage in the midst of plots of garden, and the top of it was cut out and painted like a battery mounted with guns. My own doing, said Wemmick. Looks pretty, don't it? I highly commended it. I think it was the smallest house I ever saw, with the queerest Gothic windows and a Gothic door almost too small to get in at. That's a real Flagstaff, you see, said Wemmick. And on Sundays I run up a real flag. And then look here. After I have crossed this bridge, I hoist it up so and cut off the communication. The bridge was a plank and it crossed a chasm about 4 feet wide and 2 deep. But it was very pleasant to see the pride with which he hoisted it up and made it fast, smiling as he did so, with a relish and not merely mechanically. At 9 o'clock every night, Greenwich time, said Wemmick, the gun fires. There he is, you see. And when you hear him go, I think you'll say he's a stinger. The piece of ordnance referred to was mounted in a separate fortress, constructed of lattice work. It was protected from the weather by an ingenious little tarpaulin contrivance in the nature of an umbrella. Then at the back, said Wemmick, out of sight so as not to impede the idea of fortification, for it's a principle with me, if you have an idea, carry it out and keep it up. I don't know whether that's your opinion, I said decidedly. At the back there's a pig, and there are fowls and rabbits. Then I knock together in my own little frame, you see, and grow cucumbers. And you judge at supper what sort of a salad I can raise. So, sir, said Wemmick, smiling again, but seriously too, as he shook his head, if you can suppose the little place besieged, it was hold out a devil of a time in point of provisions. Then he conducted me to a bower about 12 yards off, but which was approached by such ingenious twists of path that it took quite a long time to get at. And in this retreat our glasses were already set forth. A punch was cooling in an ornamental lake, on whose margin the bower was raised. This piece of water was of a circular form, and he had constructed a fountain in it, which, when you set a little mill going and took a cork out of a pipe, played to that powerful extent that it made the back of your hand quite wet. I am my own engineer, and my own carpenter, and my own plumber, and my own gardener, and my own jack of all trades, said Wemmick, in acknowledging my compliments. Well, it's a good thing, you know. It brushes the Newgate cobwebs away and pleases the aged. You wouldn't mind being at once introduced to the aged, would you? It wouldn't put you out. I expressed the readiness I felt, and we went into the castle. There we found, sitting by a fire, a very old man in a flannel coat, clean, cheerful, comfortable, and well cared for, but intensely deaf. Well-aged parent, said Wemmick, shaking hands with him in a cordial and jocose way. How am you? All right, John, all right, replied the old man. Here's Mr. Pip, aged parent, said Wemmick, and I wish you could hear his name, not away at him. Mr. Pip, that's what he likes, not away at him, if you please, like winking. This is a fine place of my son, sir, cried the old man, while I nodded as hard as I possibly could. This is a pretty pleasure ground, sir. This spot and these beautiful works upon it ought to be kept together by the nation, after my son's name, for the people's enjoyment. You're as proud of it as Punch, ain't you, aged? Said Wemmick, contemplating the old man with his hard face really softened. There's a nod for you, giving him a tremendous one. There's another for you, giving him a still more tremendous one. You like that, don't you? If you're not tired, Mr. Pip, though I know it's tiring to strangers, will you tip him one more? You can't think how it pleases him. I tipped him several more, and he was in great spirits. We left him bestirring himself to feed the fowls, and we sat down to our punch in the arbour, where Wemmick told me, as he smoked a pipe, that it had taken him a good many years to bring the property up to its present pitch of perfection. Is it your own, Mr. Wemmick? Oh yes, said Wemmick. I have got hold of it, a bit at a time. It's a freehold, by George. Is it indeed? I hope Mr. Jaggers admires it. Never seen it, said Wemmick. Never heard of it. Never seen the aged. Never heard of him. No. The office is one thing, and private life is another. When I go into the office, I leave the castle behind me, and when I come into the castle, I leave the office behind me. If it's not in any way disagreeable to you, you'll oblige me by doing the same. I don't wish it professionally spoken about. 即係公還公，私還私啦嚇。而 Jaggers 係完全冇去佢屋企，唔知道 Wemmick 嘅 private life。Of course, I felt my good faith involved in the observance of his request. The punch being very nice, we sat there drinking it and talking until it was almost 9 o'clock. Getting near gunfire, said Wemmick then, as he laid down his pipe, is the aged's treat. Proceeding into the castle again, we found the aged heating the poker with expectant eyes as a preliminary to the performance of this great nightly ceremony. Wemmick stood with his watch in his hand until the moment was come for him and take the red-hot poker from the aged and repaired to the battery. He took it and went out, and presently the stinger went off with a bang that shook the crazy little box of a cottage as if it must fall to pieces, and made every glass and teacup in it ring. Upon this, the aged, who I believe would have been blown out of his armchair but for holding on by the elbows, cried out exultingly, "He's fired! I heard him!" And I nodded at the old gentleman until there is no figure of speech to declare that I absolutely could not see him. The interval between that time and supper, Wemmick devoted to showing me his collection of curiosities. They were mostly of a felonious character, comprising the pen with which a celebrated forgery had been committed, a distinguished razor to some locks of hair, and several manuscript confessions written under condemnation, upon which Mr. Wemmick set particular value as being, to use his own words, every one of them lies, sir. These were agreeably dispersed among some specimens of china and glass, various neat trifles made by the proprietor of the museum, and some tobacco stoppers carved by the aged. They were all displayed in that chamber of the castle into which I had been first inducted, and which served not only as the general sitting room but as the kitchen too, if I might judge from a saucepan on the hob, and a brazen bijou over the fireplace designed for the suspension of a roasting jack. There was a neat little girl in attendance who looked after the aged in the day. When she had laid the supper cloth, the bridge was lowered to give her means of egress, and she withdrew for the night. The supper was excellent, and though the castle was rather subject to dry rot insomuch that it tasted like a bad nut, and though the pig might have been farther off, I was heartily pleased with my whole entertainment. Nor was there any drawback on my little turret bedroom, beyond there being such a very thin ceiling between me and the flagstaff, that when I lay down on my back in bed, it seemed as if I had to balance that pole on my forehead at night. 即係因為佢屋企好細啊嘛，然之後佢間屋係有一支旗杆噶嘛，咁即係呢度即係話佢屋企好細，然之後佢嗰個司令係好 low， 即係差唔多頂住，然之後佢知道嗰個屋頂就係佢支旗杆啦，咁佢咪感覺自己好似用個額頭頂住佢支旗杆，有一種咁嘅感覺，即係其實就係意味住佢間屋好細啦。Wemmick was up early in the morning, and I'm afraid I heard him cleaning my boots. After that, he fell to gardening, and I saw him from my Gothic window pretending to employ the aged, and nodding at him in the most devoted manner. Our breakfast was as good as the supper, and at 8:30 precisely we started for Little Britain. By degrees, Wemmick got drier and harder as we went along, and his mouth tightened into the post office again. At last, when we got to his place of business, he pulled out his key from his coat collar. He looked as unconscious of his Walworth property as if the castle and the drawbridge and the arbour and the lake and the fountain and the aged had all been blown into space together by the last discharge of the stinger. 即係話佢返到公司返到 office 佢變成點啊？變返做另外一個人咯，即係變返做原本佢認識嘅 Wemmick。但係其實呢個成個 chapter 係講邊個咧？就係講 Wemmick。所以我收翻我頭先嗰句，我諗住佢唔會深入探討 Wemmick， 點知唔係，佢成個 chapter 都係講 Wemmick， 仲要講佢嘅性格啦，講佢公私分明啦，講佢屋企啦，講佢過去啦，講佢身邊嘅人啦，所以其實係好深入去，即係成個 chapter default 去講 Wemmick， 所以其實係幾深入嘅，亦都話到俾我聽，即係話。喺呢個階段，似乎即係短期之內咧，阿 Jagger 似乎都係唔會點理阿 Pip 啦。因為喺阿 Jagger 唔理阿 Pip 呢段期間咧，阿 Pip 就只能夠揾阿 Wemmick，即係 Wemmick 就變成咗 effectively 變咗做佢嘅監護人。因為 Jagger 唔理你啊嘛，你最多咪同 Jagger 攞錢。但係 Jagger 要俾錢佢都係叫 Wemmick 俾錢佢嘅。其實，所以 Wemmick 冇嘢唔知嘅。而呢一個階段，當阿 Pip 仲係無所事事戇居居咧 ，Jagger 都唔會 take Pip seriously 嘅。佢都冇嘢要教佢，冇嘢俾佢做。咁變咗就反而係交託咗阿 Wemmick 去照顧佢。咁而 Wemmick 係一個好人喎，似乎，因為佢係個公還公私還私嘅人。工作上面佢可能即係都唔係好理阿 Pip， 但係佢私底下佢係會邀請阿 Pip 去佢屋企食飯、瞓、了解佢嘅生活。呢個就係 Wemmick 咯。即係 Wemmick 係點講啊？喺呢個層面佢係一個好人，但係喺工作嘅環境佢又做翻另外一個人。你明白？即又做翻一個作為 Jaggers 嘅一個 clerk 嘅一個身份。所以即係呢一樣嘢係幾深刻嘅。即係因為好可能其實好多英國人喺嗰個年代喺都市生活都係要 carry 住一個咁樣嘅身份 ，carry 住一個咁樣嘅面具去做嘢，明白？即係鐵面無私嘅，即係好繃緊嘅，又或者唔會講 private life。但係佢其實如果你熟悉咗佢嘅話，佢其實都係一個普通人啫嘛。就係咁。咁其實係有啲離咗題㗎啦，呢一個 chapter， 因為其實佢即係佢喺度介紹人物咯，咁其實個主線係冇推進到嘅，因為 Wemmick 只不過係帶出咗一樣嘢，就係阿 Pip、阿 Jaggers 仲未邀請阿 Pip 食飯，咁佢 Jaggers 邀請阿 Pip 食飯，意味咗一樣咩咧？個意義係咩咧？我個人覺得就係意義就係應該就係會提到阿 Pip 嘅工作上又好，佢身份上又好嘅發展。係啊，呢個係肯定嘅，即係唔會係佢食咗餐飯，然之後形容下餐飯去邊度食到啲乜咁啊完，唔會嘅。即係我相信呢個其實係一個意味就係。Jaggers 到要揾阿 Pip 食飯嘅時候，就意味住阿 Pip 又會再往上攀啊！即係佢一可能 Jaggers 會俾更多資訊佢又好，或者話要攞錢去讀書又好，介紹啲人俾佢又好，邀請佢去 office 做嘢，邀請佢去介紹唔知俾咩人去邊度做嘢都好，即係一定係。推進個故事嘅，推進阿 Pip 去發展嘅。佢跟住 Wemmick 係冇意義嘅，冇意思嘅。Wemmick offer 到俾你嘅就係咁多，你已經睇晒。Wemmick 擁有嘅嘢就係一間細細啲嘅屋，要行好遠。但係冇啊 ，Wemmick 就係咁咯。This is all I have. This is all I can give。係咪？咁但係 Jaggers 你就係要揾 jaggers， 你就係要厚面皮去敲門去揾 jaggers。如果唔係你就無所事事。而呢一刻阿 Pip 就係仲未做呢樣嘢，但係但係咁樣代唔代表阿 Pip 係虛耗光咧？又唔係，因為阿 Pip 有提到佢係有讀書嘅。咁但係佢又唔講佢讀乜嘢書，即係佢讀緊啲乜嘢先？你要讀書係好嚇，咁讀小説就唔係叫讀書，唔係一個 education 嚟㗎嘛。咁你要讀書，即係你可以話你讀英文，你可以讀英國文學都得㗎。但係佢冇講，佢話佢讀 science 啊 econ 即係 politics。
我諗佢都係讀英文。
當然係 in English 啦，我相信佢又唔
係啊，即係學
同埋佢甚至乎唔會提話佢嘗試學法文，因為如果你嘗試學法文，你又可以串連翻佢係咪想去法國揾 Estella？ 即係你可以咁樣去鋪一鋪，但係佢連咁樣做都冇，佢只係話我有抽時間去讀書，但係讀咩咧？所以strictly speaking， 其實你話阿 Pip 係咪虛耗光陰咧？我覺得有少少咯，因為你都唔知佢做啲乜。佢話我讀書，咁我去讀書咯，讀啲咩唔知咯。佢個老師係邊個唔知啊？係咪返學㗎唔知啊？佢可能真係買啲書翻嚟自己睇，或者借啲書翻嚟自己睇。咁你咩都半桶水啊！即係我中意就攞啲本嚟睇下，中意就攞嗰本嚟睇下咁樣嚇。咁啊唔夠專精咯。同埋你要讀書你要錢㗎嘛，其實你係要攞。其實要同 Jagger 攞錢去一啲學府度讀書，其實應該係咁樣嚇。咁但係佢而家未行呢一步咯，咁樣。咁但係都即係一個好踏實、好沉穩嘅一個 chapter 啦。咁啊，希望即係阿 Pip 快啲同 Jagger 食飯啦，即係搞清楚佢嘅路向咯。因為而家真係有少少。係咯，好悠閒啊，個故事冇推進，係嘛？OK，咁啊，我哋下一次繼續啊。OK，係咁多先，拜拜。